Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of. Actually, we don't have a name for this series yet, but we decided to give it a shot. This is a show series where we take your lists that you submit to our email and we try to make them work. We give our commentary on it. We show what their weaknesses might be, and then we also give some possible suggestions on how to bring out the most in your non-negotiables. So for today, we have a list submitted to us by Ari Santiago, and this is a Sylvaneth list of the with the Forest Folk subfaction. Going over her list now, she has a Drycha Hamadreth, 3 units of Spite Revenants, a Warsong Revenant, 2 Gossamed Archers, a Tree Lord Ancient with a Tree Lord. So that's 3 different regiments. So the Tree Lord Ancient is the general, and it has the War Singer ability. The War Singer ability lets you pick a unit wholly within 12 inches of him and gives additional 2 inches of movement. Works very well with the Spite Revenants because they move 5 inches, which is not particularly fast for this meta, and has the Seed of Rebirth, which allows it to resurrect itself on the die roll when it dies to 1 health. So this army is 3 drops, separated as in regiments based on the color of the bases as shown on the screen, and has the lore of Primal Energy, which has the Burning Head, Ravenat Snashing Jaws, and Emerald Life Swarm. So in looking at this list, I noticed a couple of defining points. One of the non-negotiables from Ari are the Spite Revenants, because she wants to focus on the Sylvaneth with the outcast sort of background. Though we're going with Forest Folk as a compromise for now. For the Forest Folk subfaction, for those at home who don't know what it does, is that it allows Sylvaneth infantry units to get an additional rend on the charge, which is very effective for the Spite Revenants. Now, I was able to playtest this list against several of my friends over the past week, and the goal of the feedback here is to make sure that the list is able to be able to show it the skill expression that it wants to emphasize, while also maintaining some sort of mid-level of competitive viability. Because at the moment, Sylvaneth is a very hard army to play. It's an army that punishes any kind of mistakes, but if you're able to properly finesse your opponent, it is very rewarding and can be very tricky to play around. Sylvaneth has a couple of battle traits. One of the battle traits is that it can heal at the end of every turn, and it heals D3 at every turn as long as they're within 6 inches of the Wildwoods. It can strike and fade, which at the end of turn and end of any turn, you can remove a unit wholly within 6 inches of an Awakened Wildwood and set it up on the battlefield within 6 inches of wholly within 6 inches of an Awakened Wildwood, while 9 inches away from all enemies. The last battle trait that it has is that you can pick a Sylvaneth unit not in combat wholly within 6 inches of an Awakened Wildwood and teleport it. Basically, this is walking the hidden paths, and set it up 9 inches away from enemy units wholly within 6 inches of a different friendly Wildwood. So, looking at this list, I noticed some issues, particularly that it doesn't do very well against cavalry and against shooting. So, Ari actually wanted to ask how this would fare against shooting and cavalry, and after playtesting it against several shooting and horde cavalry armies, I can say that this list actually lacks in mobility, so it will struggle to face against most cavalry armies, especially in a meta like this where there's a lot of manifestations and cavalry. There's also most armies will also have a single strong reinforced shooting unit for covering fire, and I'm going to go to the board to explain what the issues are. So if we move on to the main board, I've created a proxy setup for Iron Jaws facing off against the Spite Revenant list. The Spite Revenants in particular are good against infantry because with just 10 of them at 200 points, they do 31 attacks, and they can do mortal wounds on crits. Mortal damage on crits, sorry. That's some third ed talking. They also have the ability that on a 3-up in the combat phase can stop a unit from receiving enemy infantry unit from receiving commands. Now, the problem we have is that most of the time, this army can do particularly well against infantry because it moves at the same pace. With War Singer, you can extend that range to move 7 inches. But most of the time, your opponent will be playing lots of cavalry. The only army that I know right now that really front loads a lot of infantry would probably be Ogre Maw tribes, and this would probably be good against them. But the problem is that it doesn't take it's not very good at taking hits on the clapback. This is a 3-drop list, meaning that it is the average number of drops given the current meta, and if your opponent wins the roll off and forces you to go first, you only have 2 choices, both of which expose you quite greatly, in the form of seize the center or take the flanks. When you do take the flanks with the Gossamed archers, they can easily achieve these, but they then become like way too out of position for them to be able to contribute to the battle. They're gonna be easy points for your opponent to score if they are trying to harass the flanks for their own take the flanks. They're just gonna charge in, take them out, or if you shoot, then they get to move backwards a bit. But otherwise, they don't deal enough damage to really bully the enemy. I think that Gossamed archers are much better at controlling space down the middle, or finding some way to shoot at and bully lone single infantry heroes. So right off the bat, we're already struggling to create value for 220 points worth of units that need to go on the side. But if you're fighting against an infantry army, I can see that the army can have some solid ways to control the center or punish opponents for encroaching forward. With Warsinger making you move 7 inches and having a decent ability to charge in, I see that the Sylvaneth army, or this particular army, can brawl down the center, but not by too much. Why is that so? The Warsong Revenant, which usually stays back in most lists, will usually have to move forward to give the army some survivability in the form of a 6 up ward save. And the army will be very reliant on being able to summon Wildwood. What I like about the army is that you have a Tree Lord Ancient, a Warsong Revenant, and Drycha all able to summon using Tree Song. However, from my experience, if your opponent has a lot of Unbinders, it is very difficult to establish board presence with the Wildwoods. This is not specific to the army. I think Sylvaneth in general has a hard time establishing that. And if you're not able to summon any Wildwoods, the army is thus very slow. And when you are slow in this particular way, if you're able to move forward just a little bit, cavalry will often be able to move in, punch you really, really hard, and if they don't wipe the unit, they just power through and move backwards. Sort of like a strike and fade that everyone has, right? So it's very difficult. The Tree Lord does offer some utility in this respect. So if you're able to move forward, the Tree Lord in the back, and you deploy in such a way that the Tree Lord is able to get into combat range if you charge into these Spider Revenants, it creates this situation that your opponent has where if your opponent charges in, they are subject to the possibility that Tree Lord gives them strike last with their ground shaking stomp. However, from my experience, relying on the 50-50 is very difficult. Having to rely on the 4-up puts you in a lot of risk, especially since your opponent could find some ways maybe to avoid fighting the Tree Lord and get out of basically like find ways to get out of combat range with the Tree Lord. Let's assume that like basically it's the range and deployment for this is very unforgiving, especially if you need to run and move forward. Since both the Tree Lord and the Spider Revenants move at 5 inches, the run rolls need to be fairly consistent for you to create a sort of cohesive formation, especially if you are urgently trying to move toward the center. Not just that, but a formation like this suffers because if you summon an Awakened Wildwood down here and then the opponent charges into it, then you're only able to strike and fade with one unit and unable to teleport out with another unit. So leaving one of them kind of stranded since everything is synergistic. So I find that this army will struggle quite heavily against cavalry as you don't have any units that have the speed to challenge the formation of the cavalry. If you have an army that's slower than your opponent's and you're relying on a 9-inch charge for the strike and fade, you're going to see that the cavalry opponent will be able to deploy in a defensive fashion and be able to pick their fights more efficiently than you would be able to. So that's something to keep in mind with this kind of list. The Spider Revenants have 31 attacks, and on average, I kind of like it. I kind of like the amount of damage that they do. I have a newfound respect for the unit, but 5-up save on 2 wounds each is very challenging to make work. And if you don't spike on 6s like I just did, the army doesn't do very much damage. Even on Rend 1, if your opponent does an all-out defense, like let's say I attack, these are mortal wounds, and I'm wounding on 4s. On average, you're dealing, this is 8, let's say your opponent saves on 4s, it goes up to 5 because you charge. You're dealing 10 damage. Against most infantry, and let's say you're fighting other Spite Revenants, right? You're dealing 10 damage. You're killing 5 of them, and then you're still going to get hit on the clapback pretty hard. Being able to wound on 4s is really tough, and you're relying on spikes, which is extremely, from my experience, very inconsistent. So I wouldn't really go there. There are ways for you to be able to buff this up to make this better. If you use the spell from the spell lore of the Deepwood, Wrathful Spirits, to give additional rend to units within the Wildwood, I can see the Spite Revenants having rend 1 because more often than not they're charging into you in that scenario than you charging into them. So where the volume might work, but then you're still going off 3s and 4s, or if you all attack 2s and 4s. And in that scenario, the math usually lets you deal around 10 damage, which is usually not enough to bully an infantry block. What I find that the Spite Revenants are better at is if your opponent has taken some damage, the Spite Revenants are very good at finishing opponents off and threatening them with the mortal wounds, and usually like maybe 3rd or 4th activation in the combat phase where your opponent has already committed to an all-out defense elsewhere. I can see the Spite Revenants being kind of good there. Now, looking at the lore that you pick, I see that Emerald Lifeswarm benefits mostly the Tree Lord and the Tree Lord Agent, as well as Drycha and the Warsong Revenant. The issue with this is it doesn't really give lots of value to Spite Revenants because it usually at most heals 1 damage from them if they've taken damage at all. Revenant's Gnashing Jaws is very good, and I see that as being an off spell from after you're done spamming Tree Song all around. The Burning Head is okay. I've used it to chink some damage off my opponent, but overall not very reliable damage. Ravanax is your best bet, and that's if your opponent doesn't banish it, or if it's able to get a charge on 3d6. Overall, the army is fairly slow, and the lack of mobility makes it pretty hard for this army to control the battlefield. I think that Drycha is an interesting piece. I usually have her in for shooting and melee, but the thing is she's very good against infantry, and the army list submitted is already pretty decent against infantry and doesn't have a lot of tools to deal with monsters or cavalry and such. Shooting is also an issue, but it's not as bad. I find that if you're very shrewd in the way you deploy your Wildwoods, you can effectively choose the kind of unit that they would shoot at. As much as possible, I would have the Tree Lord tanking the damage because it has a 3-up save. And usually it is kind of the more expendable unit in the army, unfortunately, compared to like the Spite Revenants who drop like flies when it comes to shooting. The army is kind of slow in responding to shooting armies. Like if they create a firing lane, they can easily give you top of round and threaten you with the double by shooting out your army of 5-up save to 2 wound models. So from my experience playing this army, it struggles and relies very heavily on damage spikes for it to be able to do much of anything. I can see a very cool combo though, with the Tree Lord being behind a unit of Spite Revenants, Drycha being behind them as well, and then on hero phase, if there's an enemy nearby, casting the spell that gives +1 to hit and wound on the Spite Revenants, and having them clap back. But even then, and it increases the consistency of the unit. Let's say hitting on 2s now. Again, with the 4 mortal wounds, very consistent with the testing. And then wounding on 3s. Oh, there, I wish I rolled that for the hit roll. It creates this situation where, since you're not on the charge, most likely in this scenario, your opponent's going to be saving on, let's say, 4s. It's going to be around 12 damage, which doesn't quite deal enough damage to handle an opponent infantry that's charging in, even giving them strike last. Let's pretend you're fighting Varangard or Chaos Knights or something with a healthy amount of wounds. It's not gonna work out too well. So I have some suggestions for the list, with keeping in mind that you want to focus on Spite Revenants and Drycha. So moving over to this list that I crafted in the bottom right corner over here, Yeah, that's moving over here. I changed it up a little bit to accommodate the tempo of the list. The first thing I did was I dropped the Tree Lords because I felt that they moved too similarly to the army. I needed some way to be able to funnel the enemy army onto you, and that's why I included a unit of reinforced kernel hunters. I would usually give them priority targets so that on your turn they'd shoot enemy heroes and snipe out the enemy utility, and then use covering fire to pressure your opponents who are shooting at them. At 3s and 3s, 2 damage each, this is actually a very consistent unit for damage. I have a unit of Dryads here that go with Drycha. And for opponents that are heavily on combat, I can see them serving as a bodyguard for Drycha to give her some space and have her fight alongside them. The Tree Revenants are really good. They threaten your opponent's backline and any points that your opponent have abandoned. I took out the Gossamids because I think that they're good on paper for other lists. They're very good on monster mash lists. But in a list like this, where the Spite Revenants are basically your slow-moving hammer monsters, I find that you need some way to teleport onto an opponent's objective in the backside and threaten stealing points from them if they move too far. They themselves don't do a lot of damage, but I think that they can bully smaller heroes because in the Forest Walker sub-faction, they themselves get +1 to rend as well. So I think that's actually pretty cool and can force your opponent to think, even though they're not wholly that consistent. I kept 2 units of Spite Revenants. I swapped one of the units of Reinforced Spite Revenants out for the Dryads and the Tree Revenants. I think that this is still very good representation for them, as 3 units might be a bit too much, but 2 units counter-charging or clapping back for a unit of Dryads to screen for them is actually fairly effective, even without any of the trees. Because on the charge, it's still 31 attacks, rend 1, critical mortals on attack. And these units are a lot better at dealing with units that are softened up by the Kernot Hunters and the unit I will introduce last. I also included Spite Rider Lancers, a reinforced unit here that I've tested out to be very good against cavalry. It's particularly even better if you're able to summon a tree, strike and fade with them, and threaten your opponent's flanks with that regard. The unit is very resilient, healing 3 at the end of every turn, and having built-in anti-cavalry, which solves one of the weaknesses of the army. I also like the idea of these units moving across on the sides, and then trying to bully your opponent's backline. And the thing is, this also works even without Tree Song. So, yeah, very good on the counter charge. You put them behind screens, they move 12 inches, they're able to punch through an opponent, and then because you're most likely going to be closer to your own home base, you strike and fade with that unit. So that's what it does. I made the list into a 2-drop. You can see that you'll be able to see the list on the screen. The list being a 2-drop is very important because most lists, barring like a Death Faction Nagash list, would be a 3-drop or higher. And being able to dictate the flow of the game, being able to scope out your opponents, being able to choose priority is very important for Sylvaneth because Sylvaneth usually deploys around its own trees. Giving out information on deployment is usually not that as crucial as when your opponent does it. So yeah, being able to choose priority is very important. Lastly, while sort of in theme for Drycha being like the killier, more death side reflection of the Gairan side, I think that we should go with Morbid Conjuration. And I know that it's kind of the mainstream thing to do right now because this is objectively the best one. However, I think that specifically with the way your list wants to work, Purple Son of Shaiish giving an extra rend makes the Spite Revenants very strong because they are basically going to have rend 2 on the charge, 1 for the sub-faction and 1 for Purple Son of Shaiish, with the spell to give a +1 to hit, +1 to wound. It actually makes them have scary amounts of damage because on rend 2 with that volume is pretty strong. Suffocating Great Tide is always good as a way to bully your opponent, but that's outside of the list building aspect. It's just good overall. Maelstrom is good for doing mortal wounds and killing stuff. You have an army that, particularly when the Dryads die or whenever models die, like it pumps up the Maelstrom, right? So tends to be very good in that scenario. Lastly, Shackles is annoying and good against cavalry. and it allows you to deal mortal wounds to opponents when you win the priority or you double them, and they have no way to deal with the shackles yet. So it's usually very good. So yeah, that's what I would change with this list. I would make it a 2-drop. I would insert a unit of fast models to pressure your opponent's cavalry. I would include a unit of shooting as well, because it forces your opponent to have to come to you, which is what Sylvaneth usually wants. They want an opponent that wants to invade the tree area where the Sylvaneth army is at its strongest. And then when they come close, after they're softened up by the Kurnoth Hunters and the Spike Rider Lancers, you clap back with the Spike Revenants and finish off whatever your opponent has. I also noticed in the email that Ari wants to check out what the Twist Wheel are for. I like the Twist Wheel. It is a Warcry unit that can pick an opponent during the charge phase and reduce the charge amount by D3. I think it's actually a very good unit for when you want to do the take the flank previously and your opponent has a slow-moving unit and wants to charge into it. I think it's very interesting, although very inconsistent, because it's kind of on the slow side again, but can create some really good mind games. It's also very awkward because Eruption of Thorn Vines is an any charge phase ability, but I get the impression that your opponent does charge moves before that. I don't know, it's very weird. I think having one of them is good for experimentation. I don't really know what I would take out. I would unreinforce the Kurnoth Hunters most likely, and then just use these 3 guys to bully enemy heroes because they ignore Guarded Hero as a mechanic. One more change I would make is I would change the War Singer heroic trait with the Spellsinger heroic trait to give more consistency to the Warsong Revenants casting, so that you could summon more Wildwoods with Tree Song, and I think that's very important. So yeah, I think that's what I would change. I think Sylvaneth in general is a finesse army, very hard to play, and you're gonna have to put a lot of reps and hours to making them work. Also kind of fragile to a double turn, but with range support and cavalry support, you can deploy a lot more conservatively and to deal with cavalry and ranged threats. So that's about it. I've said all I've had to say about the list, and if you want to have your list featured, you can submit your list to wartelio@gmail.com. If you like the kind of content that we're giving out, you can give us a like and give us a sub, and hopefully this was useful to you and gives you some insight on how to build a list and how to make it work. Thank you for joining us, and see you in the next one. Bye.